Alright folks, it's time to get a short supplement for our social perception unit, and we're going to get it in a recording here in Zoom. So follow along and take notes just like you would if we were in class. So we're going to be focusing on attribution theory. With attribution theory, we are going to look at both the premise and some specific theories explaining how attribution works. But first, what are attributions? Well, the word attribution just means an explanation for your own or somebody else's behavior. And it's something that we actually wonder about almost all the time behind the scenes of our controlled thinking processes. So sometimes it's overt, like we are wondering, why is that person doing that? But other times, it's just part of our processing of social information, and we're not really aware of how we are explaining other people's behavior or our own behavior unless somebody calls attention to it. Now, there are a couple of different kinds of attributions in general. The first kind is a situational or external attribution. And this is where the explanation for somebody's behavior or your own is that the influence of the situation or the context the behavior happens in is making it happen that way. So a situational attribution is going to put the responsibility for somebody's behavior in context, which means that anybody in that same situation would probably act that same way because it's not about the person. On the other hand, we can also explain attributions in the context of the individual who did the behavior. So in this case, we would say that the attribution is a dispositional or an internal attribution. And that's saying that the reason the person acted the way that they did is because of something about their personality or their attitudes or beliefs or values or something like that. For the most part, every behavior is actually pretty complicated. It's never going to be really easily clear to say which is the real reason or the biggest reason for somebody behaving the way that they're behaving. It's always a mixture. So we act on the situations that we find ourselves in, and we are also in situations that act on us in ways that we both do and don't realize. So it's always an ongoing back and forth relationship between the situation and the person. Now, from your reading, you remember learning that a lot of the attributions that we make actually fall into a predictable trap. So we know that there's something called the fundamental attribution error. And it's called fundamental because most people are going to make this error most of the time. The fundamental attribution error is when we explain behavior as being caused by somebody's own personality or disposition. We make an internal attribution, and we don't account for outside forces like the situation or the context they find themselves in for shaping their behavior. So we tend to assume that people act the way that they act because of who they are as people, instead of looking to the situation to see how it might influence them. This is really similar to the process that we were talking about before with the correspondent inference. And sometimes you'll see something called the correspondent bias. Correspondent bias is really similar to the fundamental attribution error. We tend to assume that people's behavior corresponds to the kinds of people that they are, or what we know of them or assume is true about them. So that's our sort of starting place. We think about this in the context of the automatic processing of all of that information. You remember I showed you that diagram, flowchart of how we put together different pieces of information to understand people. Well, the correspondence bias is where we tend to overemphasize all of the things that we know or think we know about a person as an explanation for their behavior. A lot of the time, whether we're showing our bias or creating the fundamental attribution error, we're just not considering how strong situations sometimes can be. Now, we can actually level up the attribution error that we can make and commit something called the ultimate attribution error. The ultimate attribution error is when we explain somebody's behavior based on what group we think they belong to. So, for instance, we could use a stereotype about a group of people to explain a specific person's behavior. This is where we get all sorts of unkind and unfair explanations for people. If somebody isn't working or is out of a job at the moment, we might look at what we think their background is or their demographic group, and we might say it's because they're lazy. Whereas we don't know what their situation is. Maybe they were just laid off because there was a global pandemic and the business that they worked for had to shut down unexpectedly. So the ultimate attribution error can be used to explain people's behavior in all sorts of stereotypical ways, and it doesn't have to be good or bad. Like, we might say something like, that person is good at math because of their background or demographic group membership, or this person is likely to be a good CEO because of what we perceive their gender to be. So it's going against anything that we know about an individual person and explaining somebody's behavior in the context of what groups we think they belong to. So the ultimate attribution error is one step up in intensity from the fundamental attribution error. You want to beware. Now, I just said all that about stereotypes. So remember that the ultimate attribution error is applying stereotypes to explain individual people's behaviors. Now, when we are making attributions, most of the time we find that they follow particular patterns. So, for instance, we will judge any particular behavior's explanation as being one or the other of these three different balances. We either think that the cause of their behavior is stable, meaning that cause is always going to be present, or temporary. We might think this person is out of a job because of a pandemic right now. That's a temporary cause. Whereas if we said this person isn't working right now because they're lazy, that might be a stable cause. On the other side, we've got the idea of causes that are global and causes that are specific. A global attribution is going to be an explanation for behavior that actually includes a whole bunch of different behaviors. So instead of saying somebody is really good at math in particular, we might say something like, this person is good at school, or they're really smart, instead of the specific application of the explanation of they are good at math. So global is where the cause is applied to a whole bunch of different things. Specific is where the cause of the behavior is really limited to the situation in a narrow way. Not the situation, to the behavior in question in a narrow way. Then the last balance that we can make is distinguishing, like I said before, where we determine whether something is internal, caused by the person's personality, or external, caused by the situation in hand. Now we can also look for other ways to spread out our attribution patterns and find more conclusions. So, for instance, if we just take two of those things and apply them in a 2x2 grid instead of thinking them as isolated either-ors, we can put them together to come to different conclusions. So somebody has a behavior that we're explaining in a stable and an internal way, we might say that the reason why they did what they did was because of their ability. So they're good at math because that's something that is a stable quality of them being good at math, and it is about their own ability, which is centralized in them. On the other hand, let's say that they are doing poorly in a math class. If we're looking for stable external explanations, we might say that the kind of math that they're doing is really difficult, and that's why it's coming out as a stable external explanation for them doing poorly. On the other hand, we might make a temporary internal effort that says the reason why a person didn't do well on something like a math test is because they didn't put any effort into studying it. So it's a temporary thing. You can choose to put effort into something or not, but it is about your own choices and your own decisions. So that's an effort that's internally explained. And on the outside, we've got the idea of a temporary external cause, which could be like doing really well on a math test because of just luck. A person who explains their behavior or somebody else's behavior in temporary and external methods means that they're saying that whatever this outcome was, the explanation for what they did was just randomness. All right. Now we've got several patterns of explanation or patterns of attributions that we can use to look at specific outcomes. So the first pattern that we can see is a self-serving attribution, and this is where we are explaining our own behavior in a way that specifically protects and maintains our own self-esteem. So when we are protecting and maintaining our self-esteem, we are thinking about it in terms of taking credit for good outcomes. So whatever I did, if it turned out well, I'm going to say that's because of my effort, of my ability, of my input into that situation. On the other hand, if something goes badly, the idea is we blame outside forces for it. So when we're thinking about blaming outside forces for bad outcomes, there's another word that we use to describe this behavior when we see it in somebody. I'll let you think of it before I say it. If somebody's blaming an outside force for being late to work, or bombing an exam in a class, or having a messy house, what do we call that? If you thought excuse, then you're right. So we think about self-serving attributions on the side of explaining a bad outcome as an excuse. But we can also think about the good side of sort of boasting or bragging or having arrogance. So when you take personal credit for good outcomes and don't account for potential outside circumstances that could have helped you do well, then that still is going to be characteristic of a self-serving attribution. On the other side, we've got self-defeating attributions. And a lot of times, this comes along as a depressive pattern. It doesn't mean that you are depressed if you make this kind of attribution, but it oftentimes goes hand in hand. So it's not a cause or a consequence, but it's kind of potentially both. So a depressive or a self-defeating attribution is when there's a negative outcome, you say it's because of your own inability. I bombed this test because I'm stupid. Or if there's a good outcome, you give outside forces responsibility for that. Well, I did really well on this test, but it was just a fluke. So In this way of explaining behavior, we actually make it so that it's hard for us to feel good about our own actions or our decisions or our own outcomes because we are explaining it in a way that doesn't allow us to consider it objectively. Now, most of the time, when we are making attributions for our own behavior, we are more inclined towards an unintentional self-aggrandizing or sort of self-preserving attributions. Like we're more inclined towards the other one. This one is less likely of a pattern, but you can definitely see it. And I want you to listen to your own self-talk and see if this ever is identifiable in a pattern of how you think about your own actions. Now, there's some other patterns we can also look at. There's one that's called the just world hypothesis. And it's a different kind of name than something like self-serving attributions or self-defeating attributions. But this explains a coping mechanism that people use to explain and deal with what kinds of things happen in the world that are intense. So the just world hypothesis says bad things happen to bad people. So if something bad has happened to you, that must mean you did something to deserve it. And the just world hypothesis can be used to explain all sorts of things, including and oftentimes noticeably things that could not have been affected by an individual person's behavior. So, for example, natural disasters oftentimes get blamed in terms that are actually referring to the just world hypothesis. The opposite explanation for the just world hypothesis is also evident. So, good things happen to good people. And sometimes you will see this crop up in people's self-serving attributions. If I'm a good person, I expect things to go well for me because I am a good person. And if something goes badly for me, I can then quickly adjust to blaming outside forces that don't reflect badly on me as a character. One way to see the just world hypothesis in action is to listen to people who are presenting a message, oftentimes from an extremist perspective. And good examples of famous extremists are some pretty famous televangelists or religious folks. I'm not saying that all religion is extremist. I'm saying that here's a couple of examples. If you ever hear somebody explain something that happened in terms of God is angry because, then what they are expressing is their own belief in the just world hypothesis. Bad things happen to bad people. If something bad happened to you, it's because you deserved it. Reverend Fred Phelps is the founder of Westboro Baptist Church. And this is a sort of a bizarre cult. You might have actually seen them on the news. They have made a name for themselves. They are infamous for going around and doing protests with big signs with extremely offensive messages on them about what God likes or doesn't like. And his entire church's premise is identifying the things that are part of, especially mainstream American culture, that are bad as God's punishment for the things that we accept in mainstream American culture. So Fred Phelps is an extremist and a good example of the God is angry illustration of the just world hypothesis. Pat Robertson is a televangelist who is known for some kooky beliefs, and one of his examples that was pretty amazing, actually, if you remember when Haiti got hit by earthquakes several years ago, he went on his show on some cable channel and said the reason why Haiti had the earthquake was because Haitians had made a deal with the devil back in the day in order to win the Haitian rebellion. Now, the Haitian rebellion was a slave rebellion that was actually successful in freeing the slaves. But Pat Robertson said the reason why the island kept getting things like catastrophic earthquakes and catastrophic hurricanes and things like that is because long ago Haitians made a deal with the devil in order to win the war and free themselves from slavery. It's a kooky belief. Now, if you're thinking the just world hypothesis also sounds like something else that we know by another name, you're probably thinking of victim blaming. When we talk about somebody deserving what came to them, we are applying the just world hypothesis. So a lot of rape myths are actually expressions of the just world hypothesis, for example. So you might see this as an attribution pattern. When something like rape happens, if the questions first start on what was the raped person doing, wearing, drinking, where were they, those kinds of questions, you can get at the explanation being along the same lines of the just world hypothesis. Now, let's go through 2 attribution theories and see how we use this information to explain behavior. So the first attribution theory that we'll emphasize is Kelly's covariation cube. The reason why it's called that is because of a sort of a bizarre visualization of a 3D cube. But anyway, there are 3 things that people consider when using Kelly's covariation theory to explain behavior: consensus, distinctiveness, and consistency. And I'll go through each of those individually. But this is that internal corner of a cube, or as a visual illusion, you can think of it as an external corner of a cube as well. Anyway, that's just the explanation for the cube thing. The idea is, using Kelly's covariation cube, we can explain why somebody else did something. So you as the observer are trying to explain somebody else's behavior. Now these 3 components work like this. When we're looking for consensus information, the question that we ask ourselves is, do most people act the same way towards that stimulus? And that stimulus could either be a situation that you find yourself in or, something. If consensus is low, that means most people do not act that way in this situation. If consensus is high, it means most people do. So if consensus is low, it leads you towards an internal attribution for behavior, whereas if it's high, it leads you towards an external attribution for behavior. Now with distinctiveness, we are asking a specific question: does the actor's behavior also occur in different situations? So do we see this same person acting this same way in other situations or not? If we don't see them acting this way in other situations also, if we have a level of distinctiveness that means that this situation is the only place that we see them acting like this, that's actually a high distinctiveness conclusion. So low distinctiveness means this is not different or special. High distinctiveness means this is weird, or this is a unique behavior that we are seeing from this person. If it's a low distinctiveness, then it might be that they act like that in all different kinds of situations because of who they are as a person. If it's a highly distinctive behavior, it might mean that something about this particular situation or stimulus is making this person act this way here and now, when they don't act like that in other places. And then the third question is, does this behavior always occur in this situation? So in this case, we're talking about the same match of the behavior in the situation. And so in this case, you'd have to know this person in this situation over more than one occasion. So if they always act like this in this situation, then it's actually kind of hard to say. Are they always acting like this because of who they are? Or are they always acting like this because of this situation is a strong situation? On the other hand, if this is the only place and situation where we see them acting like this, then that's low consistency. It sort of stands out. And that might mean that this situation is really pushing on them hard. So we've got these three questions that we can ask, and depending on what we judge, we come to a particular conclusion. Now, a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about research methods, and I used the example of a research question that said, could petting a domesticated pet rat make a person be less disgusted by rats? I'm going to come back and use that same example to illustrate Kelly's covariation cube with the conclusions that we draw. So once you've evaluated all three of these elements, you're going to come to a conclusion that it's either an external attribution, something about the context or the stimulus is making the actor behave the way that they're acting, or you can go by each individual component. If all three elements are high consensus, high distinctiveness, high consistency, then that means it's something about the situation. On the other hand, we can make an internal attribution, meaning something about the actor is making them behave this way. If there's low consensus, meaning they're the only one acting like this, low distinctiveness, meaning they always act like this, and high consistency, meaning they always act like this. So the internal versus external conclusion there is sort of a black or white binary, but Kelly's covariation ingredients allow us to come to some conclusion. So here's an example of how you might evaluate petting a rat as a way to illustrate Kelly's covariation cube. So you can go through and look at three possible outcomes. With these three possible outcomes, you can come to the attribution of a dispositional attribution, you like rats, or the stimulus is pushing an external attribution. This rat in particular is super cute, so you just can't help but pet it. Or the situation, thinking about the teacher making you pet the rat, that's an external situation. It doesn't have anything to do with you as an individual. Now this diagram is going to be also reflected in the handout that is posted in Canvas in this module that you can use as a study guide. So you can think about this example and try and come up with examples on your own. Now, the other way that we can think about a correspondent or an attribution theory is using a correspondent inference theory. So with this one, this is coming from Jones and Davis, and the point of using this theory is to decide if somebody's behavior is dispositional or not. Now notice that I did not say dispositional or situational. We don't really know if it's a situation or a stimulus. We just are kind of using it to decide whether the person's behavior is driven by their own personality or not. With this one, we have 5 different things that we should consider instead of 3. So it sounds like it's going to be more confusing, but it's actually a little bit more logical than the covariation cube. The first factor that we would evaluate is how socially desirable is the behavior or the outcome of the behavior. So social desirability means it's normal, it's not something that you're going to get in trouble for, or that people are going to look sideways at you about, or it's going to have some sort of positive outcome in your life. The second factor is whether the behavior is freely chosen or situationally constrained. So, for instance, if you are required to do something because your teacher, your boss, your parent, your partner, your neighbor is telling you, here's what you have to do, then that's not free choice. That's not up to you, so it doesn't say anything about you if you've done it because somebody else is making you. The third factor that we would consider is, what are the outcomes of this behavior? If we do this and it actually makes life harder, then that's a negative consequence for this behavior that might be more informative than if we did it and it went really well. It doesn't actually tell us much about an individual person if they do something that is going to have a positive outcome, because most people are going to do things that have positive outcomes if they can, or unless they are really drawn to something for another reason aside from its effects. We don't really know much about a person if they're just doing what works for them. The fourth factor that we consider is whether the behavior is related to the role that they are in. So if they are in a particular role, then we know that we expect them to do particular kinds of things. If they are a baker, we expect them to work in a bakery, or be covered in flour, or really like bread. Those kinds of things are related to that role. So whatever they are doing, if it's role related, it may not actually inform us that much about their personality, but it also might be something where we can look for, if it's not role related, that does say something about the circumstance. And the last part is based on your actual knowledge of the person. So some of the examples that I've been giving are kind of like how you would evaluate some stranger that you were observing. But we also try and evaluate the behavior of people we know and are completely familiar with. And so if we have expectations about how a person is generally going to act, then we know if it's something that is about them as an individual or otherwise. Now let me put this in this example for me having pet rats. For the most part, although I know a lot of you are actually on the same page with me and even have some pocket pets of your own, for the most part, people get kind of squicked out by rats. And so it's not a really socially desirable pet like a dog or a cat that almost anybody's going to like. So for factor one, there's low social desirability for me having pet rats. For factor two, it is freely chosen. I chose to have rats instead of other pets. I could technically have other pets in this rental facility that I live in, but my lifestyle and some factors about this house and some financial things actually make it unreasonable for me, my own choice, to have other pets aside from rats. So I freely chose rats, even though the alternative was actually no pets instead of different pets. It's mostly positive consequences. I love them, they're delightful, and they make me happy. So it's working out well. And I say mostly because, you know, rats have a low, they're not very healthy as a species, and they oftentimes are needing a lot of veterinary care and they die really soon. So it's not all positive consequences, but it's mostly positive consequences in that I enjoy having them. The fourth factor is it is definitely related to my role as a psychology professor to have rats, because I can actually use them as examples in a variety of different classes that I'm teaching. And the last part is they fit my personality. Rats are a little bit of an off the beaten path kind of pet, and I am not an altogether mainstream kind of person. So they fit me because I'm also a little bit off the beaten path. So the verdict that somebody might use to judge my behavior of having pet rats is I have pet rats because of who I am as an individual. Now, when we're drawing conclusions, we don't need all 5 factors to point in the same direction, but we should be able to see social desirability, consequences, and free choice, the first 3 factors, as pointing in the same direction to help us be more confident in our conclusion. So all 5 aren't necessary, but they do help you decide the more information that you have. Now, for one more example of this, that's maybe familiar to you if you are a fan of the Harry Potter universe, is the Imperius Curse. In this Harry Potter movie, if you remember, they were learning about different curses, and in this explanation, he cursed this spider to go do all sorts of crazy things, and the spider was doing it because it was under a spell. So in this case, when we're thinking about drawing conclusions about whether somebody's behavior is driven by them or not, remember the Harry Potter books where they were talking about when people were doing bad things and not knowing if they were under Voldemort's spell or not. So we can think about free choice, we can think about social desirability, we can think about consequences, and for those people, those characters in that story, it might be that we could look at some other cause that wasn't their own character or disposition making them behave the way that they behaved. Okay, so there's a short explanation for attribution theories that you can use as a study guide for supplying additional explanation of what you read about in the book. And I would encourage you to go through, while you're learning about this, look at the handout, follow along with some of the instructions for study suggestions, and make sure that you are trying to come up with personal examples for each of these things to help you remember. Okay, that's it.